Hello, this is Gina Piscatelli again with another online lecture for the circulatory system in Anatomy and Physiology 2 at Madison College. This lecture will focus on the cardiac cycle and disorders of valve function. The material corresponds to study question number 9, and your assigned reading is chapter 18.6 for the cardiac cycle, and for the disorders of valve function, chapter 18, section 2, specifically a section called a homeostatic imbalance on page 673. And another disorder is described in the homeostatic imbalance in section 18.6 on page 688. The cardiac cycle describes all the mechanical events that occur in the heart to produce blood flow. These include contraction and relaxation of all the heart chambers, changes in blood pressure, and the opening and closing of the heart valves. The term cardiac cycle refers to, or starts with, a time point when the atria begin contracting and then ends when both the ventricles and the atria are relaxed. You're familiar with the sequence in which chambers contract and relax, but we haven't actually described a true cardiac cycle from beginning to end. So we'll discuss the mechanical events in order. A cardiac cycle begins with contraction of both atria, the right and the left. This is shown in the green box labeled number 1. During this time, the ventricles are relaxed. During the next phase of the cardiac cycle, both ventricles contract while both atria relax. This is shown in the orange box labeled number 2. At the very end of the cardiac cycle, shown in the purple box labeled number 3, both the ventricles are relaxed. In fact, the atria are also relaxed. Not enough blood has accumulated to open these atrioventricular valves yet, and they haven't contracted, so they're not ejecting blood into the ventricles yet. There's 2 terms that we need to use to adequately discuss these phases of the cardiac cycle. The terms are used for contraction and relaxation of a specific chamber. The first term is, systole, which means contraction, a period of chamber contraction. When the atria contract, they are in atrial systole. This was shown in the previous slide as number 1. When the ventricles contract, they are in ventricular systole. And this was shown in the previous slide as number 2, and it's also shown here. Please note, though, that the term systole does not always mean that blood will be ejected from a chamber. We're going to look at a specific example soon of when a chamber is in systole, but the blood doesn't actually move. So the chamber's contracted, but there's not enough force to move the blood. So that's systole. The second term is diastole. That means relaxation of a chamber. When the ventricles relax, they are in ventricular diastole. When the atria relax, they're in atrial diastole. This is shown in the previous slide and here as number 3. So in this case, both the atria are relaxed and the ventricles are relaxed. Now we're going to be a little bit more specific about phases of the cardiac cycle. There's a sequence that occurs in which the chambers contract and relax and blood flows in the heart. You already know the pathway of blood flow through the heart. So now we're going to combine that with the terms diastole and systole of the heart chambers. And I'm going to make this notes section a little bit bigger so that you can read it as I'm saying it if you would like to. So at the beginning of a cardiac cycle, the atria contract. That's our definition. So this box shows atrial systole. That's when they contract. So the green box labeled 1C is atrial systole. That's the beginning of a cardiac cycle. During this time, note that the ventricles are in diastole. They're relaxed. This means that blood will move from the atria to the ventricles because the atria are physically contracting and enough force has been generated to push the blood into the ventricles. Once the ventricles have filled with blood, ventricular systole is going to begin. So ventricular systole starts with the yellow box and it ends with the orange box. So there's actually two different phases. During this time, the atria are going to relax. So they are in diastole. At the beginning of ventricular systole, shown in the yellow box labeled number 2, blood is not ejected. The ventricles continue to contract, however, and they will eventually force blood into the aorta, oops, that was the pulmonary artery, into the red aorta and the pulmonary artery. So this is the orange box, and that shows ventricular ejection. After blood is ejected from the ventricles relax. So this is ventricular diastole and is shown in the purple box labeled number 4. Note that during this time, the atria are also still in diastole, and blood has not actually begun to move yet into the ventricles because not enough blood pressure has accumulated to open those AV valves. Finally, at the end of this cardiac cycle, which on this diagram looks like the beginning, this blue box labeled 1A and 1B, both the atria and the ventricles are still in diastole. But during this time, enough blood pressure has accumulated so that blood will flow past the AV valves. The AV valves will open and the blood will get into the ventricles. So ventricular filling does occur even before the atria enter systole. Ventricular filling occurs during both atrial diastole and atrial systole. That's the end of one cardiac cycle. So let's summarize that one more time, how blood flows during the different phases. First, let's deal with ventricular filling. Ventricular filling occurs during atrial diastole. They're relaxed, but blood flows directly into the ventricles. Also, ventricular filling occurs during atrial systole, and that's when the atria contract and eject the last little bit of blood into the ventricles. Ventricular systole begins with a period called isovolumetric contraction. What that means is no volume of blood changes in the ventricle. There's no change in volume of blood. But the wall of the ventricle is building up force through its contraction. So blood is not ejected at the very beginning, but we're still in ventricular systole. At the end of ventricular systole, blood is ejected because enough force has been generated to actually push the blood past the semilunar valves. When the ventricles relax, sorry, I should tell you, this is called ventricular ejection. When the ventricles relax, the ventricles are in diastole, And at first, this is called isovolumetric relaxation because there's no blood flowing at all. So at the end of one cardiac cycle, both the ventricles and the atria are in diastole. The key concepts to note about blood flowing and the cardiac cycle terms is that in general, a chamber in diastole will fill with blood. It's a period of relaxation of that chamber, so it'll fill with blood. That's general. Another general concept is that a chamber in systole, since that's a period of contraction, could eject blood. The tricky parts about using those general definitions are twofold. One, ventricular filling, that means blood moving from the atria into the ventricle, occurs during atrial diastole as well as during atrial systole. So we had a general term up here, a chamber in systole ejects blood. Well, here's an example of a chamber in diastole where blood is being ejected, but it's more like being dripped versus being pushed. 80% of the blood that enters the ventricle actually does so during atrial diastole. Only the last 20% is pushed into the ventricle during atrial systole. So that's tricky part number one. Tricky part number two is that ventricular systole does not continuously cause blood ejection. Ventricular filling, There are two separate events that occur during ventricular systole. One is this first period called isovolumetric contraction, and that's when blood is not ejected from the ventricles. The second period is referred to as ejection, blood ejection, and that only occurs when the ventricular pressure exceeds the pressure of the blood in the pulmonary artery and the aorta, so that those semilunar valves will open to allow blood to leave the ventricles and enter those arteries. So that's all for the cardiac cycle. Now we're going to talk about forces that actually cause blood to flow during these different phases. So I guess we have to keep talking about the cardiac cycle a little bit. The sequence in which those chambers contract is largely responsible for how blood moves through the heart. However, you've also seen that blood moves from the atria into the ventricle even when there's no contraction. So why does that happen? Well, this movement is caused, or this blood flow is caused due to a pressure gradient. So blood always flows due to a pressure gradient, and pressure gradients change throughout the cardiac cycle. But one thing stays constant, and that is blood always flows from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. So the highest pressure reached in the atria during atrial systole is 15 millimeters of mercury. During this time, the ventricles are in diastole and they have much less pressure, approximating 0 millimeters of mercury. So blood will move from 15 to 0 millimeters of mercury, from high pressure to low pressure. The highest pressure normally reached in the ventricles is 120 millimeters of mercury. Now there's usually blood also present in these arteries. It varies how much, it depends, but definitely less than 120. So blood moves from an area with 120 millimeters of mercury to a lower pressure area. Blood always moves from a high pressure region to a low pressure region. So let's look at pressure gradients during one cardiac cycle. During atrial diastole, the pressure in the atrium is greater than the pressure in the ventricle. That is why blood moves into the ventricle. Blood pressure high, blood pressure low. Blood pressure high, blood pressure low. Blood will always move to the low region. During ventricular, that happens during atrial diastole and atrial systole, I'm sorry. During ventricular systole, now pressure is building in the ventricle. As pressure builds in the ventricle, it will be higher than the pressure in the atrium. So pressure in the ventricles will be higher than the pressure in the atria. Why doesn't blood move from the ventricles into the atria? Why doesn't it go that way? So we've got like approximating right here, maybe 100 millimeters of mercury, much less here. The reason it doesn't go backwards, I'm sure you've already answered the question in your mind, is the presence of valves. Valves prevent the backflow. At the second part of ventricular systole, we actually get blood flow leaving the ventricle. So at this time, the pressure that exists in the ventricle has exceeded the pressure that is in the pulmonary artery and the aorta. So the blood will move from an area of high pressure to an area of low pressure. At the beginning of systole, ventricular systole, there was still some blood, it's not shown in the diagram, present in these arteries, but blood won't flow backwards and pressure is building in the ventricles. But the force isn't enough to exceed the force that's present in the arteries. When we reach ventricular diastole, blood is going, and also atrial diastole at this point during this phase, blood is moving from the vena cava into the atrium and from the pulmonary veins into this atrium. So the blood pressure is higher in these venous vessels than in the chamber, the two atria. So the pressure in the vena cava is higher than the pressure in the atrium. Same is true on the left side. The pressure in the pulmonary veins is higher than the pressure in the left atrium. The pressure between these two chambers, the atria and the ventricle, probably about equal at this point because the AV valves have not opened yet. So while the chamber contraction causes the force of blood flow, the heart valves really dictate the direction that blood flows. Recall that heart valves open passively due to the buildup of blood, and the AV and semilunar valves close when blood presses from the wrong side. That prevents backflow. I like this picture that's showing a superior view of the heart and the heart valves. This is the bicuspid valve, so that would be our left side, and this is the tricuspid valve, and that would be on the right side. So you know that at this point, if this heart were functional, blood could enter the ventricles. So we would be in ventricular diastole at this point. Maybe atrial systole, maybe atrial diastole, we don't know. Also, we can see the two semilunar valves. One is the aortic semilunar valve, and the other in front here is the pulmonary semilunar valve. They are both closed. So the ventricle, I just said, is in ventricular diastole. It's at rest. So it's not contracting at all. There's no chance that blood pressure has accumulated enough to push these valves open. If blood were to come down onto these two semilunar valves, it couldn't get through because they're closed. So valve function during the cardiac cycle is pretty straightforward. It's very important that they function correctly because we need efficient blood flow through the heart so that blood goes to the lungs to get oxygenated and then sent throughout the body. As expected, the atrioventricular valves are open when the ventricles are filling. This occurs during atrial diastole, shown in 1A, and during atrial systole, shown in 1C here, the green box. Those AV valves close, however, during ventricular systole in these two boxes. And that occurs so that blood will not flow backwards from the ventricle into the atria. The semilunar valves, in contrast, open at the end of ventricular systole as blood is ejected into the great arteries. The semilunar valves then close when the ventricle re-enters diastole. You can hear valves functioning when you listen to your heartbeat. These heart sounds are familiar to most of us as lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. That repeats over and over during the cardiac cycle as it continues. Those sounds are associated with the closing of the two sets of heart valves. Now, there is some debate in the literature what the sound actually is caused by, but it's commonly agreed that the sounds we hear are a result of the valves moving, but can also be due to the sounds of blood impacting the heart wall as it moves through the heart. The first sound that you hear, the lub, is when the AV valves close. So this is during ventricular systole, or when the ventricle contracts. So lub is the closure of the AV valves. That's called sound 1. The second sound, sound 2, is the dub. So lub dub dub is when the semilunar valves close, and that's when the ventricles relax. If we look at our previous schematic here for the different phases of the cardiac cycle, you can see that the heart sounds shown here, because an audiograph was taken, sound 1, sound 2, sometimes there's a sound 3, which we aren't going to talk about, then it repeats over, sound 1, sound 2. These sounds correspond to when the valves close. So sound 1 is closure of the AV valves when the ventricles enter systole. So right at this isovolumetric contraction, the AV valves close. That's sound 1. Then after ejection and the ventricle goes into relaxation or diastole, those semilunar valves close. So that's when S2 happens right here, S2. So S1, when the ventricles begin contracting, S2, when the ventricles begin relaxing. Now, heart murmurs are defined as abnormal heart sounds, and they usually occur when blood flow is more turbulent than usual, like when it flows against obstructions. So most often a heart murmur indicates a problem with a heart valve. Sometimes, however, you can hear an abnormal heart sound, otherwise known as a heart murmur, in a healthy heart. That only really occurs, though, in young children, for example, because their heart walls are thinner and they might vibrate more. Cardiologists are quite familiar with distinguishing a true heart murmur from one of these more normal heart murmurs. So for us, a heart murmur is anything that's abnormal, an abnormal heart sound. There are two categories of valve problems that cause heart murmurs. One category is valvular insufficiency, sometimes called valvular incompetence. The other category is valvular stenosis. Now, the two can be distinguished from one another by the different sounds they cause, as well as how the valve malfunctions. In one case, the valve won't close properly, and in the other case, the valve won't open properly. So I'm going to show you some pictures and talk about the sounds that you hear and what happens to the physical characteristics of the valves. So this first picture shows a valve prolapse. So in this case, the bicuspid valve is not closing properly when the ventricle contracts. So the ventricle is trying to push blood out the aorta, but some of the blood regurgitates into the atrium because a couple flaps here of the valve have prolapsed into the left atrium. So since it's not closing properly, it's categorized as an insufficient valve, excuse me, or an incompetent valve. And when this occurs, the murmur that you hear is kind of a swishing sound. So when you're supposed to hear S1, you hear swish. In the second picture, we see two valves that have the same condition in this heart. They're both stenotic. This is called valvular stenosis, and that means hardening. So calcium deposits have formed on these valves, and they've become stiff, and so they can't open properly. They kind of remain partially closed like this. The orifice, you can see here that the blood has to get through, even when a chamber contracts, is so small that it makes forward flow difficult. So in this case, we've got a valve that won't open correctly. And so this disorder would be valvular stenosis. During, while listening to the heart with this kind of disorder, you would hear a continuous clicking sound when a chamber is contracting because the blood moves in spurts through this valve. So that's the end of our fourth heart lecture. And that's it for the cardiac cycle and valve disorders. Thanks for listening.